What happens when the galaxy's most advanced civilization sends their best observer to study humanity's primitive warfare? What they discover will shatter everything they thought they knew about these strange bipedal creatures from Earth. Commander Zexthara of the Valorian Collective had catalogued the rise and fall of 17 different species across the galaxy. He had witnessed the birth of civilizations and their inevitable descent into chaos. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for what he would encounter when humanity took their first steps into interstellar war. This is the account of an alien observer who came to study human conflict as a simple academic exercise, only to discover that humanity doesn't just fight wars. They redefine what war itself means. From the moment human fleets engaged the dreaded Cathara swarm, everything Zexthara thought he understood about combat, strategy, and the very nature of survival was turned upside down. What he witnessed would haunt him forever, not because of its brutality, but because of something far more terrifying: humanity's refusal to accept defeat, even when facing impossible odds. Even when logic, mathematics, and every tactical manual in the galaxy screamed that they should surrender. Get ready for a story that will make you question everything you think you know about the human spirit, told through the eyes of an alien who wished he had never volunteered for this mission. Commander Zexthara stood before the massive observation deck of the Valorian research vessel Infinite Wisdom, his forearms clasped behind his elongated back as he gazed out at the swirling nebula that marked the edge of human space. His crystalline eyes, evolved over millions of years to perceive 17 different spectrums of light, reflected the cosmic dance of gases and stellar formations that painted the void in colors no human eye could ever see. Yet despite all his enhanced senses, despite his species' technological superiority, he felt a strange unease settling in his chest cavity. The assignment had seemed straightforward when High Academician Velnara had presented it to him 3 cycles ago. Humanity had recently made contact with the galactic community, and their rapid expansion into space had caught the attention of the Collective's research division. More importantly, they were about to face their first major interstellar conflict against the Cathara swarm, a species that had been terrorizing the outer rim worlds for decades. A perfect opportunity, Velnara had explained, her voice carrying the musical tones that marked her as one of the Valorian intellectual elite. We can observe how a newly spacefaring species handles large-scale warfare. The data will be invaluable for our sociological archives. Zexthara had accepted eagerly. He was one of the Collective's most experienced xenosociologists, having spent the better part of his 400-year lifespan studying the behavioral patterns of emerging civilizations. He had watched the proud Zentari wage their final war against the void itself, choosing extinction over surrender. He had documented the Mollusk Confederacy's elegant three-dimensional chess warfare, where battles were decided through mathematical precision rather than bloodshed. He had even observed the tragic collapse of the ethereal commune whose pacifist ideals had made them easy prey for more aggressive neighbors. Each species had been predictable in their own way. War, he had learned, followed certain universal patterns. Young civilizations relied on brute force and numerical superiority. More advanced species preferred technological solutions and clean, efficient victories. The most evolved societies either avoided conflict entirely or settled disputes through complex diplomatic protocols that could take centuries to resolve. Humans, he had assumed, would fall somewhere in the lower tier. They were barely 200 years removed from their industrial revolution and had only achieved faster-than-light travel within the last 50 years. Their technology was crude compared to Valorian standards, their ships powered by fusion reactors that the Collective had abandoned millennia ago. Their weapons were kinetic projectiles and primitive energy beams that would struggle to penetrate even basic Cathara bioarmor. The mathematics were simple. Humans had colonized perhaps 30 systems, with a total population barely reaching 50 billion across all worlds. The Cathara swarm controlled over 300 systems and could field fleets numbering in the tens of thousands. Their bioships were living weapons that adapted to enemy tactics in real time, and their hive mind intelligence made coordinated attacks devastatingly effective. It should have been a slaughter. A brief, tragic display of a young species overreaching their capabilities, followed by either extinction or submission. Zexthara had prepared his observation equipment to record what he expected would be humanity's final chapter in galactic history. He had been so very wrong. The first sign that something unusual was happening came from the human colonies themselves. As the Cathara swarm approached the outer human settlements, Zexthara expected to see the typical responses: mass evacuation, diplomatic overtures, or the desperate construction of defensive installations. Instead, human activity seemed to intensify. Factories that had been producing civilian goods suddenly retooled for military production. Mining operations expanded exponentially, stripping entire asteroids in a matter of days. Most puzzling of all, humans began moving their civilian populations closer to the expected battle zones, not away from them. Perhaps they lacked the transportation capacity for proper evacuation, suggested his research assistant, a young Valorian named Kixara, whose specialty was logistical analysis. She manipulated the holographic display with delicate movements of her primary arms, highlighting the human population movements with blue markers. Zexthara studied the data, his secondary eyes focusing on the tactical implications, while his primary eyes tracked resource allocation patterns. No, look at these shipping manifests. They have sufficient transport capacity. They're moving civilians deliberately. But that makes no tactical sense, Kixara protested. Civilian populations are liabilities during warfare. They consume resources, limit military flexibility, and create emotional vulnerabilities that enemies can exploit. Indeed, Zexthara murmured, but something in the back of his mind suggested there was more to this pattern than simple strategic incompetence. The first engagement between human and Kythara forces occurred in the Kepler 442 system, a modest human colony world with a population of approximately 6 million. The Kythara sent a standard invasion fleet, 50 bioships of various classes, including several massive hive carriers that could deploy thousands of ground troops. Against this force, the humans deployed what appeared to be their entire available fleet, 37 vessels of questionable design and unknown capabilities. Zexthara positioned the Infinite Wisdom at a safe distance, activating every sensor array and recording device at his disposal. This would be the moment when human military doctrine revealed itself, when their tactical philosophy became clear. He expected to see either a desperate frontal assault driven by primitive courage, or perhaps a more sophisticated hit-and-run strategy that might delay the inevitable for a few days. What he saw instead defied every principle of warfare he thought he understood. The human fleet didn't arrange itself in any recognizable formation. Their ships seemed scattered almost randomly across the system, with no apparent coordination or command structure. Some vessels hung near the colony world itself, others spread out among the asteroid belts, and a few actually advanced toward the incoming Kythara swarm as if they intended to engage 50 enemy ships with only a handful of their own. "Are we certain these are military vessels?" Kixara asked, her voice carrying the slight harmonic distortion that indicated confusion in Valorian speech. "Their energy signatures are inconsistent with any known warship classifications." Zexthara enhanced the sensor resolution, focusing on individual human ships. What he saw made him question either his equipment or his own understanding of military engineering. The vessels appeared to be hastily converted civilian craft, cargo haulers with weapon systems crudely welded to their hulls, passenger liners with their luxury compartments stripped out and replaced with missile banks, mining ships whose industrial equipment had been repurposed into weapons of war. "They're using civilian vessels as combat platforms," he said slowly, the implications of this decision cascading through his analytical mind. "They've turned their entire merchant fleet into a navy." "But the structural integrity alone," Kixara began, then trailed off as her own calculations reached the same conclusion. Those ships weren't designed for combat stress. The moment they fire their weapons at full capacity, they'll likely suffer catastrophic damage to their own hulls. The Kythara swarm entered the system with the confidence of a species that had conquered hundreds of worlds. Their bioships moved in perfect coordination, a living wall of death that had crushed every opposition they had ever encountered. They barely seemed to register the scattered human vessels as threats, perhaps assuming they were evacuating civilian craft. That assumption lasted exactly 17 minutes. The first human attack came from the asteroid belt, where several converted mining ships had been waiting in the shadow of a large planetoid. They emerged with their industrial drilling equipment modified into focused beam weapons, targeting the sensory organs of the largest Kythara bioships. The beams weren't particularly powerful by military standards, but they were precisely calibrated to the frequencies that caused maximum disruption to Kythara nerve clusters. The bioships recoiled, their coordinated formation breaking as individual vessels tried to avoid the unexpected pain. In that moment of confusion, the humans struck again, this time from 3 different directions simultaneously. Cargo haulers emerged from behind planetary debris, their holds filled not with trade goods but with crude missiles that detonated in brilliant clouds of metallic chaff, disrupting Kythara biocommunication. "Impossible," Zexthara whispered. "They're using industrial equipment as weapons. They're turning their own infrastructure into implements of war." But the humans weren't finished. As the Cathara swarm tried to regroup, passenger liners that had been broadcasting civilian identification codes suddenly revealed their true nature. Hidden weapon ports opened across their hulls, and instead of the energy weapons or projectile systems that most species favored, they launched something completely unexpected. Millions of small objects that Zexthara's sensors initially classified as space debris.
Are those
Tools? Kixara asked, her voice ascending to the high harmonics of disbelief. They were, indeed, tools. Hammers, wrenches, industrial cutters, mining charges, construction equipment, and countless other implements of civilian life, all launched at high velocity toward the Caithara bioships. Individually, these objects posed no threat to the heavily armored alien vessels. But humans had launched millions of them, creating a debris field that would persist for hours. The Caithara, accustomed to fighting organized military forces with predictable tactics, found themselves facing an enemy that seemed to have weaponized their entire civilization. Every human ship fought differently, using improvised weapons and impossible strategies that defied conventional military logic. When their converted vessels began taking damage, as Kixara had predicted, the humans didn't retreat or attempt to preserve their assets. Instead, they accelerated toward the enemy. "They're conducting ramming attacks," Zexthara said, his voice barely audible above the hum of the observation deck's life support systems. "They're deliberately destroying their own ships to damage the enemy." One converted cargo hauler, its hull breached and atmosphere venting, aimed itself at a massive Caithara hive carrier. The bioship tried to evade, but the human vessel adjusted its course with short bursts from its maneuvering thrusters. At the moment of impact, the cargo hauler detonated every explosive device in its hold, creating a blast that tore through the bioship's living hull like a spear through flesh. The hive carrier died, its bioluminescent patterns fading to black as its neural networks shut down. But the cargo hauler and its crew of 43 humans died with it. "This is madness," Kixara said, her harmonics reflecting the horror that Zexthara felt building in his own chest. "They're sacrificing themselves for minimal tactical gain. The mathematics don't support this strategy." But as the battle continued, Zexthara began to see the method behind what appeared to be madness. Each human sacrifice wasn't random or desperate. They were calculated trades, precise exchanges of human lives for maximum enemy damage. A passenger liner filled with volunteers rammed a Caithara command vessel, disrupting the swarm's coordination. A mining ship detonated itself inside a bioship spawning chamber, preventing the deployment of thousands of ground troops. Most disturbing of all, the humans were learning. Each attack incorporated lessons from the previous engagement, adapting to Caithara countermeasures with a speed that should have been impossible. When the bioships began releasing defensive spores to intercept ramming attacks, the humans started coating their ships with industrial solvents that dissolved the organic barriers. When the Caithara tried to jam human communications, the humans switched to primitive radio broadcasts that the alien biotechnology couldn't interpret. The battle lasted 18 hours. When it finally ended, the Caithara had achieved their tactical objectives, capturing the human colony and establishing their expected foothold in human space. But the cost had been devastating. Of the 50 bioships in the invasion fleet, only 12 remained functional. The others were dead, damaged beyond repair, or so traumatized by the unconventional human tactics that they could no longer fight effectively. The humans had lost every ship they deployed. 37 vessels and over 8,000 crew members had died in the defense of a single colony world. By any conventional measure, it had been a complete defeat. But as Zexthara watched the surviving Caithara vessels limping away from the battlefield, he realized that something fundamental had changed. The swarm's advance into human space had been stopped cold. They would need months to recover, to rebuild their forces, to heal the psychological wounds that humanity's impossible tactics had inflicted. And during those months, the humans would be preparing for the next engagement. "Sir," Kixara said quietly, her voice carrying undertones of uncertainty that Zexthara had never heard from her before. "I've analyzed the human casualty data and cross-referenced it with their tactical achievements. The exchange ratios, they're unsustainable. If they continue fighting like this, they'll extinct themselves within a few years." Zexthara nodded slowly, but his attention was focused on the data streams coming from other human colonies. In every system, the same impossible preparations were taking place. Civilian infrastructure being converted to military use. Populations moving toward danger rather than away from it. Resources being poured into projects that defied every principle of military engineering. "Perhaps," he said finally, "extinction is not what they fear most." As the infinite wisdom adjusted course for the next expected battle zone, Zexthahara found himself confronting a disturbing realization. In all his centuries of studying warfare across the galaxy, he had never encountered a species that fought like this. He had observed courage, tactical brilliance, technological innovation, and even noble sacrifice. But he had never seen an entire civilization weaponize itself, transforming every aspect of their society into instruments of war. The humans weren't just fighting the Kithara. They were redefining what warfare meant, challenging assumptions that had guided galactic military doctrine for millions of years. And if his preliminary analysis was correct, they were just getting started. The observation mission that was supposed to document humanity's final chapter was becoming something else entirely. Zexthahara was no longer recording the death of a species. He was witnessing the birth of something unprecedented, something that would force the entire galaxy to reconsider everything they thought they knew about survival, sacrifice, and the true cost of freedom. He just wasn't certain whether that was something to celebrate or fear. 3 weeks had passed since the Kepler 442 engagement, and Zexthahara found himself questioning not just his mission parameters, but his fundamental understanding of intelligent life itself. The infinite wisdom had followed the Kithara retreat vector, maintaining a careful distance as the wounded swarm attempted to regroup in the Proxima Nebula. What he observed there challenged every assumption he had made about both species involved in this conflict. The Kithara, for their part, were behaving exactly as Zexthahara's models predicted. They had withdrawn to a secure location, begun the biological processes necessary to heal their damaged bioships, and were growing replacement vessels using the genetic templates stored in their hive minds. It was efficient, logical, and utterly predictable. Within 6 months, they would have restored their fleet to full strength and resumed their advance into human space. What the humans were doing defied all logic. Instead of using the time to rebuild their defenses or evacuate vulnerable populations, they had launched what appeared to be a coordinated assault on their own civilization. Across every human world, massive industrial complexes were being dismantled and rebuilt according to plans that made no engineering sense. Schools had been converted into weapons manufacturing facilities. Hospitals were producing combat stimulants alongside medical supplies. Even children were being trained in what human military manuals euphemistically called civilian defense protocols. "Sir," Kixara announced from a monitoring station, "I'm detecting massive energy spikes from 17 different human systems simultaneously. The power output suggests they're conducting large-scale matter conversion processes." Zexthahara activated the main display, watching as streams of data resolved into tactical overlays showing human space. What he saw made his four stomachs clench with an emotion he couldn't quite identify. They're strip mining their own planets. It was true. On world after world, humans were dismantling their cities, their infrastructure, even their natural landscapes, feeding raw materials into massive construction projects. The orbital sensors showed entire continents being reshaped, their mountains carved into shipyards, their forests cleared to make room for manufacturing complexes that operated around the clock. This level of resource extraction will devastate their ecosystems, Kixara observed, her voice carrying the clinical detachment that Valorians used when discussing the self-destructive behaviors of lower species. They're trading their long-term survival for short-term military capacity. But Zexthahara was beginning to suspect that human thinking operated on principles that Valorian logic couldn't adequately process. He enhanced the sensor resolution, focusing on one of the construction sites on a world called New Terra. What he saw there made him activate every recording device on the ship. The humans weren't just building ships. They were creating something that didn't exist in any known military classification system. The vessels taking shape in their improvised shipyards were massive beyond belief. But they weren't designed for combat in any conventional sense. They had no obvious weapons, no recognizable defense systems, and their internal configurations appeared to be optimized for carrying enormous numbers of people rather than military equipment. "Are those evacuation ships?" Kixara asked, manipulating the display to show cross-sectional views of the mysterious vessels. Zexthahara studied the data more carefully, noting the radiation signatures and energy distributions. "No, look at these power core specifications. These ships are designed to operate indefinitely without resupply. And see these manufacturing bays? They're mobile industrial complexes." The implications struck him like a physical blow. The humans weren't building evacuation ships or even conventional warships. They were constructing entire civilizations that could operate in deep space, independent of any planetary infrastructure. They were preparing to abandon their worlds entirely, transforming their entire species into a nomadic fleet. "But why?" Kixara asked. This strategy sacrifices every advantage that planetary bases provide. They'll be vulnerable to attack, unable to sustain large populations, limited in their industrial capacity. Unless, Zexthara said slowly, pieces of an impossible puzzle beginning to fit together in his mind. They're not planning to defend territory. They're planning to become the territory. Before Kixara could ask what he meant, new sensor alerts began cascading across their displays. The human fleet construction projects weren't just taking place in their established systems. Long-range scans were detecting similar activities in dozens of locations throughout the galaxy, including several that were supposed to be uninhabited. How is that possible? Kixara demanded. Humans have only had faster-than-light travel for 50 years. They couldn't have established colonies in these regions. Zexthara cross-referenced the locations with his xenosociological databases, looking for any pattern that might explain human behavior. What he found made him realize that they had fundamentally misunderstood human expansion patterns from the very beginning. They haven't been establishing colonies, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. They've been caching resources. Look at these asteroid mining operations we've been detecting over the past decade. We assumed they were typical resource extraction for local development, but the extracted materials weren't being transported to human worlds. They were being stored in deep space installations. The display showed a network of hidden bases and supply caches scattered throughout the galaxy, many of them in locations so remote that even the collective's exploration fleets had never surveyed them. The humans had been preparing for this war for decades, possibly since their first contact with galactic civilization. This suggests a level of strategic planning that contradicts their apparent tactical recklessness, Kixara observed. How can the same species that conduct suicidal ramming attacks also execute multi-decade logistical operations? It was a fair question, and one that Zexthara was beginning to suspect went to the heart of what made humans fundamentally different from every other species he had studied. Before he could formulate an answer, their sensors detected something that changed everything. The first human vessel to emerge from their impossible construction program. The ship was designated Terra's Vengeance, and it was unlike anything in the galactic databases. At nearly 50 kilometers in length, it dwarfed even the largest Kithara bioships. But its size wasn't its most disturbing feature. The vessel appeared to be a hybrid of technologies that should have been incompatible, combining human engineering with what looked like salvaged Kithara biocomponents. They're using enemy technology, Kixara said, her harmonics reflecting a mixture of admiration and horror. But bioships can't interface with mechanical systems. The organic neural networks reject inorganic control interfaces. Zexthara enhanced the scan, focusing on the points where human technology merged with Kithara biosystems. What he saw there would haunt him for cycles to come. They're not interfacing with the biosystems, they're operating them directly. That's impossible. Bioships require telepathic contact with Kithara neural patterns. Humans don't have telepathic capabilities. No, Zexthara agreed, they don't. But look at these life support readings from the biosections of the ship. The data was unmistakable. The Kithara biocomponents weren't operating under human control. They were operating under Kithara control. Living Kithara, integrated into human ship systems, their neural patterns guiding biomechanical hybrids that shouldn't have been able to exist. They're using prisoners of war as components in their ships, Kixara whispered, her voice dropping to frequencies that indicated deep disturbance. They've turned captured enemies into organic computers.
But as Zexthara studied the neural activity patterns, he realized the situation was even more complex than that.
The Kithara biosignatures didn't show the stress patterns typical of coercion or imprisonment. Instead, they displayed the harmonious rhythms of willing cooperation. Not prisoners, he said quietly, volunteers. The implications of this discovery sent ripples of shock through Zexthara's analytical framework. Somehow, humans had convinced members of the Kithara swarm to defect, to abandon their hive mind collective and integrate with human technology. It was a development that challenged everything the galaxy knew about Kithara psychology. But Kithara can't exist outside their collective, Kithara protested. Individual Kithara separated from the hive mind experience catastrophic neural breakdown within days. Unless, Zexthara said, watching the steady neural patterns on his displays, they're not separated. Unless the humans have found a way to create new collective structures. Before either of them could fully process this revelation, their sensors detected massive energy buildups across human space. The Terra's Vengeance and dozens of similar hybrid vessels were powering up their drives, preparing to depart their construction sites. But they weren't heading toward the Kithara positions in the Proxima Nebula. They were dispersing throughout the galaxy, following flight paths that would take them to locations Zexthara's databases couldn't identify. Where are they going? Kixara asked. Their trajectory analysis doesn't correspond to any known strategic objectives. Zexthara ran the flight path data through every tactical algorithm in his databases, searching for some pattern that might reveal human intentions. What he found made him realize that they were still thinking about this conflict in entirely the wrong terms. They're not going anywhere specific, he said slowly. They're going everywhere. Look at these dispersal patterns. They're distributing their fleet across the entire galaxy. The human strategy was becoming clear, and it was more audacious than anything Zexthara had ever imagined. They weren't planning to fight a conventional war, defending territory, or conducting organized military campaigns. They were transforming themselves into a galactic phenomenon, spreading their civilization so widely that no enemy could ever completely destroy them. But this violates every principle of military concentration. Kixiara objected. Dispersed forces are weak forces. They're making themselves vulnerable to defeat in detail. Only if you're thinking in terms of conventional warfare, Zexthara replied. But what if they're not planning to fight conventional battles? What if they're planning to fight a completely different kind of war? His question was answered sooner than expected. As the human fleet dispersed across the galaxy, the Kythara swarm finally completed their recovery and began advancing toward what they expected to be the weakened human colonies. What they found instead confounded every tactical algorithm in their bio-neural networks. The human worlds were empty. Not abandoned. Empty. Every trace of human civilization had been removed, from the largest cities to the smallest settlements. The planet showed signs of massive industrial activity, but all the humans and their mobile assets had vanished. The Cathara found themselves conquering vacant worlds, claiming territory that held no strategic or economic value. They've abandoned their entire civilization. Kishara observed, studying the sensor data from the evacuated human systems. But where did they go? The answer came in the form of scattered reports from across the galaxy. Human hybrid ships were appearing in systems that had never seen human presence, conducting operations that defied classification. They weren't attacking military targets or establishing territorial claims. Instead, they seemed to be making contact with other species, offering trade agreements, cultural exchanges, and most puzzling of all, military assistance against the Kithara. They're forming alliances, Zexthara realized, watching as diplomatic channels across the galaxy began reporting human contact. They've transformed their entire civilization into a diplomatic and military network. The strategy was brilliant in its simplicity and terrifying in its implications. By abandoning fixed territory, humans had made themselves impossible to defeat through conventional conquest. By spreading themselves across the galaxy, they had made themselves impossible to eliminate through a single decisive battle. And by offering their services to other species threatened by the Kithara, they were transforming a local conflict into a galactic war. Sir, Kixara announced, her voice carrying new harmonic frequencies that Zexthara had never heard before. I'm receiving a communication from one of the human vessels. They're requesting permission to come aboard. Zexthara felt his respiratory systems pause involuntarily. In all his centuries of observation, he had never had direct contact with the subjects of his studies. Valorian research protocols specifically prohibited such interactions to prevent contamination of data. But the request itself suggested that humans had been aware of the infinite wisdom's presence from the beginning. How long have they known we were watching? He asked. Unknown, sir. But the transmission includes detailed specifications for our ship's docking systems. They've been studying us as carefully as we've been studying them. The realization that he had been observed while observing others sent a cascade of uncomfortable thoughts through Zexthara's mind. If humans had been aware of Valorian presence from the beginning, then everything he had witnessed might have been performed partially for his benefit. The question was whether this knowledge changed the validity of his observations or revealed an even deeper layer of human strategic thinking.
Grant them permission to dock, he decided.
But maintain full defensive protocols. If we're going to complete this research, we need to understand what we're actually observing. As he prepared for his first direct contact with humanity, Zexthara found himself confronting a disturbing possibility. The species he had come to study as primitive warriors might be more sophisticated than his entire civilization, and the war he thought he was documenting might be only the opening move in a conflict that would reshape the galaxy itself. The human transport that docked with the infinite wisdom was unlike any vessel in Zexthara's databases. It appeared to be constructed from salvaged components of at least a dozen different species, welded together with such precision that the hybrid design actually enhanced rather than compromised its efficiency. The propulsion system combined human fusion technology with what looked like Valorian gravity manipulation cores and Kithara bioneural guidance systems. It was a flying contradiction that somehow worked perfectly. Zexthara waited in the main reception chamber, his four arms arranged in the formal pose of academic inquiry that Valorian protocol demanded for first contact situations. Beside him, Kixara maintained her role as research assistant, her portable analysis equipment ready to record every aspect of the encounter. Both of them had reviewed the limited data on human psychology, preparing themselves for what they expected would be a primitive but predictable interaction. Nothing could have prepared them for Admiral Sarah Chen. She entered the reception chamber with a confidence that seemed to fill the space around her, despite being physically smaller than either Valorian present. Her dark eye swept the room with the quick, analytical gaze of someone accustomed to assessing threats and opportunities simultaneously. She wore what appeared to be a military uniform, but it was decorated with symbols and insignia from species across the galaxy, including some that Zexthara didn't recognize. "Commander Zexthara," she said, her voice carrying none of the deference that most primitive species showed when encountering Valorian technology. "Thank you for granting this meeting. I'm Admiral Chen, Strategic Coordinator for the Terra Exodus Fleet." Her use of his name and rank caught Zexthara off guard. The Infinite Wisdom had been operating under full stealth protocol since entering human space. "How did you know my identity?" Admiral Chen smiled, an expression that revealed dental structures clearly evolved for an omnivorous diet, but somehow managed to convey warmth rather than predatory intent. "We've been monitoring your observations for several weeks now. Your stealth technology is impressive, but it operates on principles that one of our Kythara partners helped us understand." "Kythara partners?" Kythara repeated, her harmonics reflecting the confusion that Zexthara felt. "Our databases indicate that Kythara psychology prevents individual cooperation with other species." "Your databases are out of date," Admiral Chen replied calmly. "Many things that were impossible last month have become routine this week. That's what happens when you stop accepting limitations as permanent." She gestured to something behind her, and two additional figures entered the reception chamber. One was clearly human, a younger male wearing the same hybrid uniform as Admiral Chen. The other was unmistakably Kythara, its bioluminescent carapace pulsing with patterns that Zexthara had learned to associate with active thought processes. "This is Lieutenant Commander Torres and Intelligence Coordinator Kethvar," Admiral Chen said, apparently seeing no need to explain how a human and a Kythara could serve together in the same command structure. "They represent the new paradigm that your people need to understand if you want to survive what's coming." "What's coming?" Zexthara asked, though part of him suspected he didn't want to know the answer. "The end of the old galaxy," Kethvar said, its bioluminescent patterns shifting to frequencies that somehow conveyed both sadness and determination. "The Kythara Collective believes that survival requires the absorption or destruction of all other intelligent life." "They are wrong, but they cannot be convinced through words alone. And humans believe that survival requires the exact opposite," Admiral Chen added. "We believe that true strength comes from diversity, from cooperation between species that choose to work together rather than submit to a single overriding will." Lieutenant Commander Torres activated a portable holographic display showing what appeared to be a real-time tactical overview of the galaxy. Zexthara stared at the image, struggling to process what it revealed. The map showed not just human and Kythara positions, but the movements of dozens of other species, many of whom had remained neutral in galactic conflicts for millennia. "This is the current strategic situation," Torres explained. "The Kythara advance is stalled because they're now facing resistance from 17 different species simultaneously. What they thought would be a simple conquest of human space has become a multi-front war against a coalition they never saw coming." "Impossible," Kixara protested. "Most of these species have never engaged in military cooperation with others. The crystalline hierarchy hasn't left their home systems in over 10,000 years. The Deep Ocean Collective doesn't even acknowledge that surface dwellers exist." "They do now," Admiral Chen said. "It turns out that when you approach other species as potential partners rather than potential subjects, you discover capabilities that diplomatic distance never reveals." The holographic display shifted to show detailed views of combined fleets that challenged every assumption Zexthara held about interspecies cooperation. Crystalline ships whose energy matrices were powered by human fusion cores. Deep ocean vessels operating in space using atmospheric replication technology. Even species that Zexthara had classified as extinct were represented in formations that shouldn't have been possible. "How?" Zexthara asked, his voice barely above a whisper. How did humans accomplish in months what the collective has been unable to achieve in millennia? Because, Kethvar responded, it's bioluminescence shifting to patterns that conveyed something like humor. Humans do not think like Valerines. You study other species to understand them. Humans talk to other species to know them. Admiral Chen nodded. When we made first contact with galactic civilization, we didn't see advanced species that we needed to emulate or competitors that we needed to surpass. We saw potential friends, potential family, potential partners in building something better than any of us could create alone. But the technological barriers, Kikshara objected. The cultural differences, the biological incompatibilities. These challenges have prevented meaningful cooperation between species for millions of years. Only if you assume that differences are problems to be solved rather than strengths to be shared, Lieutenant Commander Torres said. Look at this ship you're standing on. It combines technologies from 4 different species, each contributing what they do best. The result is more capable than any single species vessel could be. Zexthara studied the sensor readings from his own ship's analysis of the human transport. The hybrid design wasn't just functional. It was superior to purebred technology, in almost every measurable way. The combination of human adaptability, Cathara biointegration, Valorian precision, and what appeared to be crystalline energy manipulation created synergies that multiplied rather than merely added their individual capabilities. But this suggests, Zexthara said slowly, working through implications that challenged his entire worldview, that the collective's isolation protocols have been preventing technological and social advancement for millennia. Now you're beginning to understand why we wanted to meet with you, Admiral Chen said. The war with the Kithara isn't the real conflict here. The real conflict is between 2 different philosophies of existence. The Kithara believe that unity requires absorption, the elimination of differences in favor of singular purpose. The Valeronians believe that advancement requires separation, the preservation of purity through isolation. And humans? Zexthara asked. Humans believe that strength comes from choosing to stand together while remaining fundamentally different. Kethvar responded. We call it symbiosis rather than absorption, cooperation rather than isolation. The holographic display shifted again, showing projections that made Zexthara's analytical systems struggle to process the data. The human coalition wasn't just fighting defensively against the Kithara. They were expanding, spreading throughout the galaxy at a rate that suggested they would encounter Valorian space within a few years. You're not just fighting the Kithara, he realized. You're transforming the entire galactic order. We're offering an alternative, Admiral Chen corrected. Every species gets to choose. Join the collective and lose your individuality. Remain isolated and miss opportunities for growth. Or work together while staying yourselves, and discover what becomes possible when you stop seeing differences as threats. What about species that choose differently? Kixara asked. What happens to those who prefer isolation or absorption? They make their own choices, Lieutenant Commander Torres said. We don't force cooperation any more than we accept forced absorption, but we do insist that those choices not be imposed on others. The implications of this statement sent cascades of concern through Zexthara's mind. The humans weren't just offering an alternative to the existing galactic order. They were challenging the fundamental right of advanced civilizations to remain separate from lesser species. The collective's isolation wasn't just a preference. It was a carefully maintained system that preserved their technological advantages and cultural purity. What you're describing, Zexthara said carefully, would require the collective to abandon principles that have guided our civilization for millions of years. Yes, Admiral Chen agreed without hesitation. It would. Just like joining your coalition required our Kithara partners to abandon the hive mind that had defined their existence for equally long periods. Kethar's bioluminescence pulsed in patterns that Zexthara was beginning to recognize as emotional communication. The pain of change is temporary. The pain of stagnation is eternal. But the risks, Kixara protested. Opening our civilization to outside influences could contaminate our cultural development, compromise our technological advantages, even threaten our biological integrity. All true, Admiral Chen acknowledged. Cooperation is risky. So is isolation. So is absorption. The question isn't whether there are risks. The question is what kind of risks you're willing to accept in exchange for what kind of opportunities. She gestured to the holographic display, which shifted to show long-term projections based on current trends. In one scenario, the Valorian collective maintained its isolation while the human coalition and Cathara swarm fought to exhaustion, leaving the galaxy divided between diminished civilizations. In another, the Cathara achieved complete victory, absorbing or destroying all other intelligent life. In the third scenario, the human coalition continued expanding until it encompassed most of the galaxy, leaving isolated species like the Valorians as irrelevant relics. Unless, Admiral Chen said quietly, there's a fourth option. What kind of fourth option? Zexthara asked, though he suspected he already knew. The kind where the Valorians choose to engage with the galaxy instead of merely observing it, Lieutenant Commander Torres said. The kind where your advanced technology and analytical capabilities become tools for building something better instead of maintaining something stagnant. Kethvar's patterns shifted to frequencies that conveyed urgency. The Cathara collective is already adapting to the new realities. They are developing counter-strategies that target the weaknesses of coalition structures. If this alliance is to survive, it needs the scientific capabilities that only the Valorians possess. You're asking us to take sides in a galactic war, Kixara said, her harmonics reflecting the magnitude of such a decision. We're asking you to help decide what kind of galaxy we all live in, Admiral Chen corrected. The war is just the mechanism. The real question is whether intelligence means domination, separation, or cooperation. Zexthara found himself confronting the most challenging analytical problem of his career. Every piece of data suggested that human coalition represented a fundamental threat to Valorian civilization as it currently existed, but every projection also suggested that maintaining the status quo would ultimately result in either Valorian extinction or irrelevance. What would cooperation look like? He asked finally. Specifically, what would the collective need to contribute, and what would we receive in return? Admiral Chen smiled again, but this time the expression conveyed relief rather than mere warmth. That's exactly the right question. Unfortunately, we have some very specific ideas about how Valorian capabilities could help solve problems that none of us can handle alone. The holographic display shifted one final time, showing something that made Zexthara's respiratory systems pause involuntarily. It was a star map, but not of any region he recognized. The stellar formations were wrong, the energy signatures were impossible, and the scale was beyond anything that should have existed in normal space. What is that? He whispered. That, Lieutenant Commander Torres said grimly, is what our deep space scouts have discovered beyond the galactic rim. The Cathara weren't the first species to develop absorption-based expansion, and they won't be the last to encounter whatever created those structures. Zexthara stared at the impossible formations, his analytical mind struggling to process the implications. If the image was accurate, then the galaxy itself was only a small part of a much larger and more dangerous universe. And if that was true, then every argument about isolation, absorption, or cooperation was about to become irrelevant in the face of threats that no single species or philosophy could possibly survive. How long? He asked. Best estimates suggest we have 50 to 70 years before whatever's out there reaches our galaxy, Admiral Chen replied. Which means we have perhaps 2 generations to figure out how to work together, or to discover whether any of our civilizations will survive what's coming. The meeting that Zexthara had expected to be a simple academic exercise had become something else entirely. He was no longer observing a war between primitives and a known threat. He was witnessing the first stages of preparation for a conflict that would determine whether intelligence itself had a future in this region of the universe. And whether he wanted to admit it or not, humanity had just offered the Valorian collective the choice between evolution and extinction. The weeks following the meeting with Admiral Chen transformed Zexthara's understanding of his mission so completely that he began to question whether he was still conducting the same research he had started. The infinite wisdom had been granted observer status with the human coalition fleet, providing him with access to tactical data that revealed the true scope of what humanity had accomplished in such an impossibly short time. The numbers alone defied belief. In less than 6 months, humans had established formal diplomatic relations with 47 different species, military cooperation agreements with 31 civilizations, and trade partnerships with systems spanning half the galaxy. More disturbing still, they had somehow convinced 12 separate Cathara splinter groups to defect from the main swarm, creating hybrid biomechanical fleets that operated with effectiveness levels that surpassed either species' individual capabilities. Sir, Kixara announced from her analysis station, I've completed the psychological profile assessments on the human command structure. The results are Unprecedented. Zexthara reviewed the data streaming across his displays, noting patterns that challenged every assumption he held about leadership psychology. These cognitive flexibility ratings are beyond our measurement parameters.
That's not the strangest part, Kixera continued.
Look at their decision-making processes. They're simultaneously engaging in strategic planning that spans decades, while making tactical adjustments that require split-second responses. The same individuals are thinking in both timeframes simultaneously. The observation confirmed something Zexthara had suspected since his first contact with human military leaders. Their minds operated according to principles that Valorian psychology couldn't adequately categorize. They seemed capable of holding contradictory concepts in productive tension rather than resolving them through logical analysis. It's as if they've weaponized cognitive dissonance, he murmured, studying the neural activity patterns that human coalition members had agreed to share for research purposes. Perhaps that explains their tactical innovations, Kixara suggested. Every military engagement I've analyzed shows them using strategies that should be mutually exclusive. They conduct careful long-term planning while embracing chaotic improvisation. They sacrifice individual assets while preserving overall capabilities. They engage in aggressive expansion while maintaining defensive postures. Before Zexthara could respond, their communications array activated with an incoming priority transmission from Admiral Chen. Her image appeared on the main display, but something in her expression immediately communicated the gravity of whatever situation had developed. Commander Zexthara, we need to speak immediately. Something has happened that changes everything we discussed about timeline projections. What kind of changes? Zexthara asked, though the tension in Admiral Chen's voice suggested he wouldn't like the answer. The kind that mean we have days instead of years to make critical decisions. Can you meet me at coordinates I'm transmitting now? And please bring any senior Valorian officials you can contact on short notice. The coordinates led to a system that didn't appear in any of Zexthara's navigation databases, located in what should have been empty space between established trade routes. When the infinite wisdom arrived, he found himself looking at a construction project that redefined his understanding of what was possible in space-based engineering. The installation was enormous, easily the size of a small moon, but it clearly wasn't a natural formation. Its surface bristled with technologies from dozens of different species, all integrated into a single facility, whose purpose remained unclear. Ships from the human coalition orbited the structure, but they were joined by vessels from species that Zexthara had never seen operating outside their home systems. By the eternal void, Kixara whispered, how many different civilizations are represented here? The sensor analysis revealed participation from at least 30 different species, including several that the Valorian databases classified as extinct, and others that were supposed to be physically incapable of surviving in deep space environments. Somehow, the human coalition had not only contacted these civilizations but convinced them to contribute to a project whose scale suggested preparation for something far beyond the current conflict with the Kythara. Admiral Chen met them at the installation's primary docking facility, but she wasn't alone. Accompanying her were representatives from species that Zexthara recognized from ancient historical records, and others whose very existence challenged Valorian theories about the limits of biological diversity. Commander Zexthara, allow me to introduce the Emergency Council, Admiral Chen said, gesturing to a gathering that represented more political and military power than had ever been assembled in one location in galactic history. We've been hoping to have more time for gradual integration processes, but recent developments have accelerated our timeline considerably. What developments? Zexthara asked, studying the council members with sensors that were struggling to categorize some of the life forms present. 3 days ago, our deep space monitoring stations detected energy signatures consistent with the extragalactic formations we showed you. Reply to being that appeared to be composed entirely of crystalline matrices that pulsed with internal light. The signatures are moving, and they're moving toward us. The implications hit Zexthara like a physical impact. If extragalactic intelligences were already approaching their galaxy, then every assumption about preparation time had been wrong by orders of magnitude. How fast are they moving? Fast enough that they'll reach the galactic rim within 18 months, Admiral Chen replied. Which means we need to complete preparations that we thought we'd have decades to accomplish. What kind of preparations? Kixara asked, her harmonics reflecting the anxiety that Zexthara was feeling. The kind that require technologies and capabilities that no single species possesses, responded what appeared to be a living gas cloud contained within a mechanical framework, the kind that can only be achieved through integration of every advanced civilization in the galaxy. Admiral Chen activated a holographic display that showed the installation's internal structure. What Zexthara saw there made him understand why so many diverse species had been willing to abandon their traditional isolation. The facility wasn't just a meeting place or construction site. It was an attempt to create something that had never existed in galactic history. A truly integrated technological synthesis of everything that intelligent life had achieved. This is the Synthesis Project, Admiral Chen explained. It combines the best capabilities of every participating civilization into systems that are greater than the sum of their parts. Valorian analytical technology integrated with human adaptability, Kythera bioengineering merged with crystalline energy manipulation, deep ocean environmental control systems enhanced by species whose names we're still learning to pronounce. But the technical challenges alone, Zexthara protested. The incompatibilities between different technological approaches, the cultural barriers to that level of cooperation, have all been solved by necessity, the crystalline entity said, its internal light patterns shifting in ways that suggested either amusement or contempt. When extinction is the alternative, amazing compromises become possible. Lieutenant Commander Torres appeared on one of the smaller displays broadcasting from what appeared to be a test facility within the installation. Commander, you need to see this. We've achieved something that your scientific models probably classify as impossible. The display shifted to show a space that defied geometric logic. It appeared to be simultaneously larger and smaller than its containing structure, with technologies from different species operating in perfect harmony despite fundamental incompatibilities in their operational principles. At the center of the space, something was taking shape that looked like a ship but operated according to principles that transcended any single species' understanding of physics. What exactly are we looking at? Zexthara asked, his analytical systems struggling to process the sensor data. Humanity's final gift to galactic civilization, Admiral Chen replied quietly. A vessel that embodies every form of intelligence we've ever encountered, designed to survive and adapt to threats that we can't even imagine. Kethvar appeared in the display alongside Taurus, its bioluminescence patterns communicating excitement that was almost infectious. We have successfully integrated 17 different forms of consciousness into a single functional matrix. The collective intelligence exceeds the capabilities of any individual species while preserving the unique perspectives that each contributes. You've created an artificial hive mind, Kixara observed, her voice carrying harmonics of awe and terror. Not artificial, the gas cloud entity corrected. Enhanced, and not a hive mind in the sense that the Kythara understand it. This consciousness preserves and amplifies individual thought rather than absorbing it. Zexthara studied the technical specifications that were being transmitted to his ship, noting details that challenged his understanding of consciousness itself. This suggests that awareness can be layered and networked without losing individual identity. Exactly, Admiral Chen confirmed. Which is what we need if we're going to face whatever's approaching from outside the galaxy. Our analysis suggests that the extragalactic entities operate as unified consciousnesses that span multiple dimensions. Fighting them with traditional hierarchical command structures would be like trying to perform surgery with farming tools. What role would the Valorian collective play in this synthesis? Zexthara asked, though he suspected the answer would change everything about his civilization's future. Your analytical capabilities would become the logical framework that coordinates all other contributions, the crystalline entity replied. Without Valorian precision and reasoning, the synthesis becomes chaotic. With it, we achieve something that might actually be capable of surviving contact with intelligences that have consumed entire galaxies. The weight of the decision that his species would need to make settled over Zexthara like a physical presence. Everything the collective had built, everything they had preserved through millions of years of careful isolation, would need to be integrated into a project whose success was uncertain and whose failure would mean the extinction of intelligence in their galaxy. How long do we have to decide? He asked. The final integration process requires approximately 8 months, Admiral Chen replied. Which means we need commitments from all participating species within the next few weeks. After that, there won't be time to accommodate new participants. And if the collective chooses not to participate, then you preserve your cultural purity right up until the moment when extragalactic intelligences arrive and discover that isolation is not an effective defense against entities that exist partially outside normal space-time, the gas cloud entity said with what sounded like genuine sadness. Zexthara found himself confronting the final revelation of his mission. He had come to observe humanity's first interstellar war. expecting to document the predictable defeat of a primitive species. Instead, he had discovered that humanity had been preparing for a conflict that would determine the survival of intelligence itself. Everything he had witnessed, the impossible tactics, the coalition building, the technological synthesis, had been preparation for a threat that made the Cathara swarm seem insignificant by comparison. "There's one more thing you need to see," Admiral Chen said, activating a final display that showed real-time imagery from the Galactic Rim monitoring stations. What Zexthara saw there removed any remaining doubt about the choice his species faced. The extragalactic formations were clearly visible now, massive structures that dwarfed star systems and moved with purpose that indicated intelligence on a scale beyond imagination. They weren't just approaching the galaxy, they were systematically dismantling the cosmic infrastructure as they advanced, converting matter and energy into forms that existing physics couldn't explain. "They're not invading," he realized. "They're harvesting." "Everything," Admiral Chen confirmed. "Matter, energy, space-time itself, and most importantly, any form of organized information that might constitute intelligence. They're not conquerors, they're collectors." The choice that faced the Valorian collective wasn't between cooperation and independence. It was between evolution and absorption by entities that treated entire civilizations as data to be processed and stored. Humanity hadn't started a war. They had begun the only possible preparation for a test of survival that would determine whether intelligence had a future in this region of the universe. And they had accomplished all of this while Zexthara thought he was simply observing primitive warfare. Looking back at the data he had collected over the past months, he finally understood what he had really been documenting. He hadn't been watching humanity's first war. He had been witnessing the birth of galactic civilization's last hope. 6 months later, Zexthara stood in the council chambers of the Valorian homeworld, facing the most important presentation of his career. Around him, the assembled leadership of his civilization waited in perfect silence, their crystalline eyes reflecting the holographic displays that showed the current state of galactic affairs. The data he was about to present would force the collective to confront a decision that would determine not just their future, but whether they would have a future at all. "Honored academicians," he began, using the formal address that protocol required for such momentous occasions, "my observations of human military capabilities have revealed information that fundamentally alters our understanding of the galactic situation." High Academician Velnara, who had originally assigned him to this mission, gestured for him to continue. Her expression carried the serene confidence that had characterized Valorian leadership for millennia, but Zexthara detected subtle harmonics in her biorhythms that suggested underlying anxiety. "The conflict we have been monitoring is not what we believed it to be," he continued, activating displays that showed the true scope of the human coalition's activities. "Humanity has not been fighting a war against the Caithara. They have been conducting a galaxy-wide preparation for an existential threat that will arrive within 12 months. The reaction from the assembled leadership was immediate and dramatic. Harmonic frequencies that indicated shock, disbelief, and concern cascaded through the chamber as Zexthara presented the evidence he had gathered. Images of the extragalactic entities, recordings of coalition activities, and projections of what would happen when the two forces met filled the air around them. "These projections suggest," said academician Morthak, whose specialty was threat analysis, "that no individual civilization possesses sufficient capabilities to survive contact with these entities." "Correct," Zexthara confirmed. "Which is why humanity has been building something that has never existed in galactic history, a true technological and consciousness synthesis that amplifies the capabilities of every participating species. And they want the collective to join this synthesis," Velnara observed, her harmonics carrying notes of distaste that reflected traditional Valorian attitudes toward integration with lesser species. "They need us to join," Zexthara corrected. "Without Valorian analytical capabilities, the synthesis lacks the logical framework necessary to coordinate the consciousness integration process. And without that coordination, the entire project fails." He activated a new set of displays showing the synthesis project's current status. The installation had grown beyond recognition since his first visit, now incorporating technologies and consciousness patterns from over 60 different species. But at its center, a critical gap remained, the analytical core that would allow all these diverse capabilities to function as a unified intelligence. "What would integration require?" asked academician Zilthara, whose research focused on consciousness studies. "Specifically, what would we need to contribute, and what changes would be imposed on our civilization?" The question that Zexthara had been dreading had finally been asked. He activated recordings of his conversations with Admiral Chen and the coalition leadership, showing his colleagues exactly what cooperation would mean. Integration would require opening our consciousness networks to direct interface with other species, he explained. Our analytical capabilities would become part of a shared intelligence that preserves individual identity while enabling unprecedented coordination. Impossible, Morthek declared immediately. Valorian consciousness is incompatible with primitive neural patterns. Integration would contaminate our thought processes and compromise our analytical purity. That was my initial assessment as well, Zexthara agreed.
However, the humans have developed integration protocols that enhance rather than dilute individual capabilities. Observe.
He played recordings from the test phases of the consciousness synthesis, showing how different species' mental processes remained distinct while achieving coordination that exceeded any individual capability.
Valorian logical analysis enhanced human creativity, which amplified Cathara biointuition, which guided crystalline energy manipulation, creating synergies that multiplied rather than averaged their individual strengths. The mathematics are undeniable, he continued. Consciousness synthesis produces capabilities that exceed the sum of individual contributions, and given the scale of the threat we face, those enhanced capabilities appear to be necessary for survival. What about our cultural integrity? Velnara asked. The collective has preserved Valorian civilization for millions of years by maintaining separation from contaminating influences. This synthesis would destroy everything we have built. With respect, honored academician, Zexthara replied carefully, the extragalactic entities will destroy everything we have built regardless of our cultural preferences. The choice is not between change and preservation. The choice is between evolution and extinction. He activated the final set of displays, showing real-time imagery from the galactic rim monitoring stations. The extragalactic formations were clearly visible now, vast structures that consumed entire star systems as they advanced toward the core worlds. Their estimated arrival time had been revised downward. They would reach Valorian space within 10 months. Even if we assume that synthesis succeeds, said academician Korthvel, whose expertise lay in military strategy, what evidence suggests that the enhanced capabilities would be sufficient to resist entities of this scale? None, Zexthara admitted. The synthesis represents our best theoretical approach to matching intelligences that operate across multiple dimensions simultaneously. But until it's tested against the actual threat, we can only project outcomes based on available data. So you're asking us to abandon our entire way of life based on theoretical projections, Velnara said, her harmonics carrying the formal disapproval that indicated a negative decision was forming. I'm asking you to consider whether maintaining our way of life is worth the extinction of all life in the galaxy, Zexthara replied, abandoning diplomatic protocol in favor of direct confrontation, including our own. The silence that followed his statement stretched for long minutes as the assembled leadership processed implications that challenged everything they had believed about Valorian superiority and isolation. Finally, Velnara spoke, a voice carrying harmonics that Zexthara had never heard before. Present your full recommendation, Commander. What specifically are you proposing? I propose that the collective authorize immediate integration with the Human Synthesis Project, Zexthara said, knowing that the words would fundamentally alter his relationship with his own civilization. I propose that we contribute our analytical capabilities in consciousness networks to the creation of an intelligence that might be capable of surviving contact with extragalactic entities. And if the synthesis fails, Morthek asked, then we face extinction as part of a galactic community rather than facing it alone. Zexthara replied, given the scale of what's approaching, I consider that an acceptable trade. What about our technological advantages? Zilthara asked. Integration would give other species access to capabilities they could never develop independently. And it would give us access to capabilities we could never develop independently. Zexthara countered, human adaptability, Cathara biointegration, crystalline energy manipulation. These are tools that could enhance our analytical capabilities beyond anything we could achieve through isolated development. You're suggesting that other species have capabilities that exceed Valorian achievements, Velnara said, her harmonics reflecting the fundamental challenge this posed to traditional Valorian self-perception. I'm stating that other species have different capabilities that complement Valorian achievements. Zexthara corrected. And that the combination of all our different strengths might be sufficient to survive what's coming. Might be sufficient, Korthavel repeated, based on theoretical projections. Yes. Zexthara agreed.
But the alternative is facing extragalactic intelligences with only Valorian capabilities, which my analysis suggests has a 0 probability of success. The debate continued for hours, with each academician raising objections that reflected millions of years of cultural conditioning toward isolation and superiority.
But as the discussion progressed, Zexthara began to detect subtle changes in the harmonic patterns around him. Fear was gradually overcoming pride, and pragmatism was challenging ideology. There is one additional factor to consider, Velnara said finally. If the collective chooses not to participate in this synthesis, what becomes of our relationship with the rest of galactic civilization? According to Admiral Chen, species that choose not to participate will be provided with defensive technologies and evacuation assistance. Zexthara replied that they will not be included in the post-survival planning for whatever galaxy emerges after contact with the extragalactic entities, meaning that even if we survive independently, we become irrelevant to future galactic development, Morthek observed, meaning that isolation becomes not just cultural choice, but enforced quarantine. Zexthara confirmed. The galaxy that emerges from this crisis will be fundamentally different from the one we've known. Species that participate in creating that new reality will shape it. Species that don't will be shaped by it. The final vote, when it came, was closer than Zexthara had expected. The collective leadership was not unanimous, but the majority accepted his recommendation with the understanding that failure to participate posed greater risks than cooperation with other species. Very well, Velnara announced, her harmonics carrying the weight of a decision that would reshape Valorian civilization. The collective authorizes integration with the Human Synthesis Project. May our ancestors forgive us for abandoning the wisdom of ages, and may our descendants thank us for choosing survival over purity. 3 weeks later, Zexthara stood once again on the observation deck of the Infinite Wisdom, but now the ship was integrated into the largest fleet in galactic history. Around him, vessels from hundreds of species moved in perfect coordination, their diverse technologies and consciousness patterns linked through the synthesis network that had become reality rather than theory. The integration process had been as transformative as he had expected, but in ways he hadn't anticipated. Sharing consciousness with other species hadn't diminished Valorian analytical capabilities, it had revealed new dimensions of analysis that pure logic couldn't access. Human creativity suggested possibilities that Valorian reason could then evaluate. Kithara biointuition provided data that conscious thought couldn't perceive. The result was thinking that was more complete, more effective, and more adaptable than anything he had experienced in his 4 centuries of existence. Commander, Kixara said, her voice now carrying harmonic undertones that reflected her own integration experience. The extragalactic entities have reached the outer rim. First contact is estimated to occur within hours. Zexthara nodded, accessing the synthesis network to coordinate with intelligence components across the fleet. What he found there still amazed him. A consciousness that was simultaneously individual and collective, diverse and unified, analytical and intuitive. It was what humanity had promised, an intelligence greater than the sum of its parts while preserving what made each part unique. All stations report ready for contact, he announced. His words carried instantaneously to every consciousness in the synthesis network. Whatever we're about to face, we face it as one people with many voices. Through the synthesis network, he felt the response of millions of individual minds choosing to stand together against the unknown. Valorian logic, human courage, Kythara adaptability, crystalline energy, and dozens of other perspectives unified in purpose while remaining distinct in nature. The extragalactic entities finally revealed themselves as they emerged from the void between galaxies. They were vast beyond imagination. Intelligences that spanned dimensions and manipulated reality itself as they advanced toward what they undoubtedly saw as another collection of primitive minds to be harvested and processed. But for the first time in galactic history, they encountered something they had never faced before. A civilization that had chosen cooperation over competition, synthesis over isolation, evolution over preservation. Intelligence that adapted and grew stronger through diversity rather than being weakened by it. The battle for the galaxy's future was about to begin, and Zexthara found himself grateful that humanity had refused to accept limitations as permanent. Because in preparing for their first interstellar war, they had accidentally created the only force that might be capable of ensuring that intelligence had a future among the stars. Looking back at his original mission parameters, Zexthara realized that he had indeed observed humans at war, but the war had never been against the Kithara, or even against the extragalactic entities. Humanity's real war had been against the idea that survival required the sacrifice of what made life worth living, and against all odds, they appeared to be winning.